What happens when a calm morning talk show suddenly turns into a moment no one in the studio can forget? The lights inside the set of The View glow softly across the polished table. The cameras glide into position, and the audience settles into their seats with the quiet hum of anticipation. It's supposed to be another lively but predictable episode. A Hollywood star arrives, the hosts ask questions, the audience laughs, and everyone leaves smiling. But sometimes something else happens. Sometimes a conversation turns sharp. Sometimes a question lands like a spark on dry grass. And sometimes a guest who's known for staying calm decides he's had enough. Today's guest is none other than Brad Pitt, one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, a man who has spent decades navigating the spotlight with a careful balance of charm and restraint. Across the table sits Joy Behar, a host famous for her sharp wit, quick opinions, and fearless commentary. And what begins as a routine interview slowly builds into a moment that no one, not the audience, not the hosts, and certainly not the viewers at home, expects. But before we step into the tension of this unforgettable exchange, take a second to support the channel. If you love dramatic celebrity stories and behind-the-scenes moments like this, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, like this video, and drop a comment telling us what you think before the story even begins. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories from the world of entertainment. Now, let's step into the moment. The studio audience applauds as Brad Pitt walks onto the set. The applause isn't polite, it's thunderous. For decades, Pitt has carried the rare kind of celebrity aura that blends movie star charisma with a quiet, almost mysterious composure. Whether he's starring in films like Fight Club or Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, audiences have watched him transform again and again on screen. But today, he's not here as a character. He's here as himself. And sometimes, that's when things become unpredictable. Brad takes his seat, offering a relaxed smile to the hosts. The camera cuts across the panel. Whoopi Goldberg leans back with her familiar calm presence. Sunny Hostin flips through her notes, and Joy Behar sits forward slightly, her expression alert, curious, and already hinting that she might have something interesting planned. At first, the conversation flows easily. They talk about Brad's recent projects, the changing landscape of Hollywood, and how the industry has evolved over the years. The audience laughs when Brad shares a light story about filming mishaps. Joy chuckles along with the others, but her eyes remain focused. Anyone who has watched the show long enough knows that Joy Behar often waits for the moment when a conversation can turn deeper or sharper. Brad finishes telling a story about working with younger actors. The applause fades. There's a brief pause. Joy leans forward. Her voice carries that familiar tone, half playful, half probing. "So, Brad," she says, tilting her head slightly, "you've had one of the most fascinating careers in Hollywood. But people also know your personal life has sometimes been just as headline-worthy." A ripple of laughter moves through the audience. Brad smiles politely. He's heard this before. For years, his life outside the screen, his relationships, his divorces, his personal struggles, have been dissected across every entertainment outlet imaginable. But Joy isn't finished. She glances toward the audience, then back at him. "You've been in the spotlight for decades," she continues. "And yet it feels like people still debate who the real Brad Pitt is." Brad shifts slightly in his chair. It's subtle, but the camera catches it. A tiny pause. "Do they?" he replies with a faint smile. Joy laughs. "Oh, come on," she says. "You know they do." The audience chuckles again, but there's a slight tension now, like a violin string pulled just a little tighter. Brad folds his hands on the table. "Well," he says calmly, "I think people sometimes know the headlines more than the person." Whoopi nods thoughtfully. "That's fair," she says. But Joy isn't ready to move on. Her voice sharpens just a touch. "But headlines usually come from somewhere." A few audience members shift in their seats. Brad keeps his expression steady. "Sometimes," he says. Joy tilts her head again. "And sometimes," she adds carefully, "they come from choices." Now the energy in the room changes. It's subtle but undeniable. The laughter fades. Brad's smile grows thinner. He's still composed, but something behind his eyes shifts. Joy senses it. She presses forward. "I mean, let's be honest," she says. "When people talk about you, they're not just talking about movies. They're talking about relationships, breakups, drama, all of it." Brad exhales slowly. The audience is completely silent now. He's been through interviews like this before. The questions, the speculation, the endless curiosity about his past with Angelina Jolie and Jennifer Aniston. Most of the time, he deflects, laughs it off, changes the subject. But today, something feels different. Joy leans closer to the table. And I guess what people wonder is, she continues. She pauses. The studio is so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights seems louder. Do you ever feel like the image you built in Hollywood eventually caught up with you? A few audience members gasp softly. Whoopi's eyebrows lift slightly. Sunny glances sideways at Joy. It's one of those moments where everyone senses the conversation stepping closer to a line. Brad Pitt sits still for a moment. He studies Joy's face. Then he leans back in his chair. His voice remains calm, but there's a new edge beneath it. Well, he says slowly, that depends on who's telling the story. The audience murmurs. Joy smiles, the kind of smile that signals she believes she's steering the conversation exactly where she wants it. Oh, I think the public tells it pretty clearly, she replies. Brad nods once. And the public, he says quietly, usually hears the loudest voices first. The words hang in the air. Joy raises an eyebrow. And you're saying those voices aren't accurate? Brad pauses again. He glances briefly toward the audience. Then back at Joy. I'm saying, he says, his tone slightly firmer now, that when people repeat something long enough, it starts sounding like truth, even when the full story isn't there. The room grows still. Joy folds her arms. So what's the full story, Brad? The question lands harder than the ones before it. And for the first time since the interview began, Brad Pitt's calm exterior begins to crack just enough for everyone to notice. He leans forward slowly. The cameras tighten their focus, because in that moment, the friendly morning interview on The View begins to transform into something else entirely. And what Brad Pitt says next will leave the entire studio stunned. But that moment is only the beginning. The air inside the studio feels heavier now. Not loud, not chaotic, just tense. The kind of tension that creeps in quietly, wrapping around the room until everyone suddenly realizes something has shifted. Across the table, Brad Pitt leans forward slightly, his fingers resting against the polished surface. His expression is still calm, almost too calm, but the softness that had been there earlier is gone. The audience senses it. So do the hosts. A few seconds earlier, this was a routine celebrity interview on The View. Now it feels like something far more unpredictable. Joy Behar watches him carefully, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. Anyone who has followed her career knows she isn't afraid of uncomfortable conversations. In fact, she often welcomes them. And right now, she believes she has asked the question that finally forces the real Brad Pitt to speak. So what's the full story, Brad? She repeats, her voice steady. For a moment, he doesn't answer. The silence stretches across the table. The audience shifts in their seats. A camera operator slowly zooms in. Brad exhales softly through his nose. Then he speaks. You know what's interesting? He says quietly. Joy tilts her head. What's that? Brad glances around the studio, the cameras, the audience, the panel. You sit on a stage like this, he says, and people expect you to summarize 20 or 30 years of your life in a couple of sentences. A few audience members nod. Joy shrugs slightly. Well, that's part of being a public figure. Brad gives a small, almost amused smile. Sure, he says. But sometimes the questions assume they already know the answer. A faint ripple moves through the audience. Joy taps her pen against the table. So are you saying the public has it wrong? Brad pauses again. You'd be surprised how often people fill in the blanks themselves. The comment hangs in the air. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg leans back slightly, studying Brad with a thoughtful expression. She's been through moments like this on the show before. Moments where the conversation suddenly steps onto dangerous ground. Joy, however, presses forward. But Brad, she says, you can't pretend the headlines just appeared out of nowhere. Brad nods slowly. No, he says. They didn't. The audience leans in. Joy senses momentum. So when people talk about your relationships, your breakups, the controversies, those aren't just rumors. Brad's jaw tightens for the first time. Some things were private matters that became public stories, he replies. Joy raises an eyebrow. And some things, she adds, were very public situations. The room grows quiet again. Brad tilts his head slightly. You mean my marriages? Joy doesn't hesitate. Yes. A few audience members gasp softly. The names don't even need to be spoken for everyone to know what she's referring to. The decades of fascination surrounding Brad Pitt's relationships with Jennifer Aniston and Angelina Jolie. Stories that fueled magazine covers, endless speculation, and countless television debates. Brad takes a slow breath. Those were real relationships, he says calmly. Not storylines. Joy responds quickly. But when you're one of the biggest movie stars in the world, people feel invested in those stories. Brad's voice grows firmer. They weren't stories. There's a slight pause. They were people. The audience reacts with a low murmur. Sunny Hostin glances toward Whoopi again. Joy folds her hands together. Fair enough, she says. But the public watched those relationships unfold in real time. And sometimes it seemed like the narrative kept changing. Brad's eyes narrow slightly. Narrative, he repeats. Joy nods. Yes. Brad leans back again. And who writes that narrative, he asks. Joy smiles faintly. Well, journalists, tabloids, fans, people watching from the outside. Brad tilts his head. And talk shows. The words land like a quiet thunderclap. For the first time, Joy's smile fades slightly. The audience reacts with a louder murmur now. Joy laughs lightly, trying to keep the mood casual. Oh, come on, she says. We're just asking questions. Brad nods. I know, but you seem a little defensive. The comment draws a few surprised sounds from the crowd. Brad pauses. Then he leans forward again. Let me ask you something, he says. Joy gestures toward him. Go ahead. Brad looks directly at her. How many times have you had a stranger explain your life to you? Joy blinks. Well, that's not really. No, seriously, Brad continues, still calm but noticeably more intense. How many times has someone who's never met you told millions of people exactly what you were thinking, what you were feeling, why you made certain choices? The room is completely silent now. Joy shifts slightly in her seat. That's different, she says. Is it? She opens her mouth, then closes it again. Brad's voice softens, but the weight of his words remains. I've spent years watching people debate my life like it's a movie script. The audience listens closely. People argue about who was right, who was wrong, who betrayed who, he continues. Joy interjects. Well, some situations were pretty clear to the public. Brad turns his head slowly toward her. Were they? The tension spikes again. Joy crosses her arms. You're saying the public misunderstood everything? Brad shakes his head. No. Then what are you saying? Brad pauses. For a brief moment, his eyes move across the audience again. Hundreds of faces watching every expression. Then he answers. I'm saying the loudest voices don't always know the quiet parts of the story. Whoopi nods slowly. That's true. Joy sighs. But Brad, people don't invent these conversations. They respond to what they see. Brad smiles faintly. Or what they're shown. Joy leans forward again. And what exactly were we shown? Brad's expression changes again, not angry but sharper. You were shown headlines, he says. And those headlines came from real events. Brad nods. Pieces of real events. The audience murmurs louder now. Sunny shifts in her chair. Joy shakes her head slightly. So you think the media got it wrong? Brad chuckles quietly. I think the media got the version that sold the most magazines. A few audience members clap. Joy looks toward them briefly, then back at Brad. So what's the truth then? She asks. Brad studies her face carefully. For a moment, it looks like he might dodge the question. But then something changes. A decision. His posture straightens. You want the truth? He says. Joy nods. Yes. Brad glances at the audience once more. Then back at the hosts. The truth, he says slowly, is that most of the people discussing my life weren't there when the real moments happened. Joy begins to respond. But Brad continues before she can. They weren't in the room during the hard conversations. They weren't there during the quiet nights when families were trying to figure things out. The room is absolutely still. And yet, Brad says, his voice calm but unmistakably pointed, they spoke about it like they had front row seats. Joy exhales through her nose. Well, that's what happens when you live publicly. Brad nods once. Maybe. Then he adds something that sends another ripple through the audience. But sometimes the people asking the questions are just as invested in the story as the tabloids. Joy's eyebrows lift. Are you saying we're part of the problem? Brad meets her gaze. I'm saying conversations like this can either look for understanding or look for drama. The audience erupts into a mix of applause and shocked laughter. Joy leans back in her chair. Well, she says slowly, it is television. Brad smiles slightly. Yes. Then his eyes sharpen again. But that doesn't mean everything should be treated like entertainment. The silence that follows is heavier than anything earlier in the interview. For the first time since the segment began, Joy Behar looks genuinely unsure of what to say next. And the moment everyone expected to be a casual celebrity chat has now become something far more intense. Because Brad Pitt has finally stopped dodging the questions. And what he's about to say next will push this confrontation even further. The silence lingers longer than anyone expects. Inside the studio of The View, something unusual has taken hold of the room. It isn't chaos and it isn't shouting. It's the heavy stillness that happens when a conversation suddenly stops being entertainment and starts becoming personal. Across the table, Brad Pitt sits with his hands folded, his posture calm but steady, like someone who has finally decided he's done dancing around a subject. The audience can feel it. The hosts can feel it. Even the camera operators sense the shift, tightening their shots as if they know something unforgettable is unfolding in real time. A few seconds pass. Then Joy Behar exhales and leans forward again. Her voice returns, measured but still edged with the same curiosity that brought the conversation here in the first place. "Well," she says slowly, "I don't think anyone here is trying to exploit your life, Brad. We're talking about things that became very public." Brad tilts his head slightly. "They became public," he repeats. "But that doesn't mean they belong to the public." A ripple of murmurs moves through the audience. Joy opens her hands in a small shrug. "That's the price of fame." Brad gives a small, thoughtful nod. "That's what people say." Then he leans forward again, and something in his voice changes. It isn't louder, but it's sharper. And maybe that's the problem. The words hang in the air. Joy studies him carefully. "What do you mean by that?" Brad glances briefly toward the audience again, then back to the hosts. "For years," he begins, "people have talked about my life like it was a long-running television drama." A few audience members chuckle awkwardly. Brad doesn't. "They debate characters," he continues quietly. "They pick sides. They decide who's the villain, who's the hero." His eyes shift slightly toward Joy. "But real life doesn't work like that." Joy folds her arms again. "People respond to what they see," she repeats. Brad nods slowly. "Yes, but what they see is rarely the whole picture." The tension grows thicker. Across the table, Sunny Hostin finally speaks up, her voice calm but careful. "I think what Joy is getting at," she says, "is that the public has followed your story for years. Naturally, people have opinions." Brad nods toward her. "I understand that." Sunny continues. "And sometimes people want to hear your side." Brad smiles faintly. "I've tried to give that." Joy leans in again. "But sometimes it feels like you avoid it." The audience gasps softly. Brad's expression tightens slightly. "Avoid it," he repeats. Joy nods. "Yes." Brad sits back in his chair again. "You know," he says thoughtfully, "I've done thousands of interviews in my life." Joy raises an eyebrow. "I can imagine." Brad continues. "And most of the time, I'm happy to talk about my work, my experiences, things I've learned along the way." He pauses. "But there's a difference between sharing your life and defending it." That line sends a ripple through the audience. Joy taps her pen on the table again. "But if there's a misunderstanding," she says, "why not clear it up?" Brad's eyes lock onto hers. "Because sometimes clearing it up just feeds the same machine." The studio grows quieter again. Joy shakes her head slightly. "So you'd rather let people believe whatever they want?" Brad shrugs lightly. "I'd rather focus on the people who actually know me." The comment draws applause from several audience members. Joy glances toward the crowd, then back at Brad. "Well," she says, "you can't blame people for being curious." Brad smiles faintly again. "I don't blame curiosity." Joy leans closer. "But," Brad's voice becomes firmer, "I do question when curiosity turns into judgment." The audience reacts with another wave of murmurs. Joy laughs lightly. "Oh, come on, Brad," she says. "People aren't sitting around judging your every move." Brad doesn't laugh. Instead, he says something that immediately shifts the tone again. "Aren't they?" Joy pauses. Brad gestures slightly toward the cameras. There are entire shows built around discussing other people's lives. The room grows tense again. Joy's smile tightens. "Well, that's part of cultural conversation." Brad nods. "Sometimes." Then he adds quietly, "And sometimes it becomes speculation dressed up as discussion." The audience erupts into a mix of applause and shocked laughter. Joy leans back in her chair. "So now we're the tabloids." Brad shakes his head calmly. "I didn't say that. But you're implying it." Brad studies her face carefully. Then he finally says the line that will echo far beyond the studio. "I'm saying that when someone's life becomes entertainment, It's easy to forget there are real people behind the headlines. The words land like a stone dropped in water. For a moment, no one speaks. Even the audience is completely silent. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg finally leans forward. Her voice is calm but firm. I think what Brad is trying to say, she says slowly, is that sometimes we forget celebrities are human beings. Brad nods slightly toward her. Exactly. Joy sighs. I don't think anyone here believes you're not human. Brad tilts his head. Then why do people talk about our lives like they're fictional? The question lingers. Joy looks like she's about to respond, but Brad continues before she can. I've watched strangers argue about my family, he says quietly. The audience listens intently. I've seen people who've never met me decide what kind of father I am, what kind of husband I was, what kind of person I must be. The tension in the room is now almost electric. Joy's expression softens slightly. That must be difficult. Brad nods. It is. He pauses. Then his voice becomes slightly more intense. But what's harder is when the conversation keeps going year after year, even when the people involved are trying to move on. A few audience members clap again. Joy glances toward them. Then she turns back to Brad. So what would you prefer? She asks. Brad shrugs slightly. Maybe more empathy. Joy smiles faintly. That's a nice idea. Brad meets her gaze again. It's also a necessary one. The studio grows quiet again. For a moment, it feels like the tension might finally ease. But Joy Behar isn't known for ending difficult conversations early. And the next question she asks pushes the moment to the edge. She leans forward once more. All right, she says carefully. Let me ask you something directly. Brad waits. Joy takes a breath. You say people misunderstand your life, she says. But when the headlines about your divorce from Angelina Jolie exploded, when those stories about family conflicts surfaced, those weren't just rumors. The audience gasps again. Sunny looks toward Joy quickly. Whoopi raises her eyebrows. But Joy keeps going. So if people got the wrong impression, she says, why didn't you fight harder to correct it? The room freezes. Brad Pitt's expression changes. Not dramatically, but enough that everyone watching, in the studio and at home, can see the shift. The calm movie star demeanor fades slightly. And in its place, something far more real appears. Brad leans forward slowly. His voice drops, quieter than before. But heavier. You really want to go there? Joy holds his gaze. I ask the question. The audience sits in absolute silence. Because everyone senses the same thing in that moment. The conversation has reached the point where there's no safe way to turn back. And what Brad Pitt says next will send shockwaves through the entire studio. The silence that follows feels almost unreal. Inside the brightly lit studio of The View, the air seems heavier than it has at any point during the conversation. Even the audience, usually quick to react with laughter or applause, sits frozen in anticipation. Across the table, Brad Pitt leans forward slowly, his hands resting against the edge of the desk. His expression has changed. Not angry, not explosive, but unmistakably serious. He studies Joy Behar for a moment before answering her question. You really want to go there? Joy holds his gaze. I ask the question. The audience shifts in their seats. Everyone can feel it now. The conversation has reached the moment where something real might finally be said. Brad exhales quietly. Then he nods. All right. The room becomes completely silent. When my divorce from Angelina Jolie happened, he begins slowly, it wasn't just a headline to me. His voice is calm but heavy. It was the collapse of a family. The audience listens without a sound. Brad continues. There were kids involved. There were emotions involved. There were a lot of things happening behind closed doors that no one outside that situation truly understood. Joy watches him carefully now, her expression less confrontational than before. Brad's eyes briefly drift toward the audience. And yet within hours, he says quietly, the world had already decided exactly what happened. The crowd murmurs softly. Brad continues. People who had never met us were suddenly experts on our marriage. He pauses. Experts on our parenting. The audience shifts uncomfortably. Joy finally speaks again, her voice softer this time. But the reports came from somewhere. Brad nods. Yes, they did. He pauses again before adding something that immediately grabs the room's attention. But reports don't always equal truth. A few people in the audience clap quietly. Brad continues speaking, his voice steady but carrying years of quiet frustration. There were legal processes, private discussions, Therapists, lawyers, family members trying to sort through something incredibly painful. He glances briefly at the cameras. But the public conversation didn't wait for any of that. Joy folds her hands together. Well, that's the reality of the media world. Brad nods slowly. I know. He pauses. But knowing something doesn't make it easier. The audience is completely still again. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg leans forward slightly. That kind of scrutiny can break people, she says. Brad nods. It does. He looks down briefly at his hands before continuing. For a long time, I stayed quiet. Joy raises an eyebrow slightly. Some people would say too quiet. Brad looks back up. Maybe. Then he says something that causes a ripple through the entire studio. But sometimes silence is the only way to protect the people you love. The audience reacts with a wave of applause. Joy watches him thoughtfully now. So you stayed silent for your kids? Brad nods. For my kids. For my family. For the people who didn't sign up for their lives to become entertainment. The room grows quiet again. Joy takes a breath before speaking. I understand that, she says. But you have to admit, when public figures stay silent, people fill in the blanks. Brad nods again. They do. Then he adds. But that doesn't mean those blanks are accurate. The audience murmurs again. Brad leans back slightly in his chair now, his tone calmer but still firm. I'm not here to relitigate my divorce, he says. And I'm not here to assign blame. He pauses. But I am here to say something that I think a lot of people in this industry feel. Joy tilts her head. What's that? Brad looks around the room once more. When someone's personal life becomes public property, it stops being a conversation and starts becoming a spectacle. The audience breaks into applause again. Even some of the hosts nod. Joy sighs slightly. Well, we are a talk show. Brad smiles faintly. I know. Then he says something that instantly becomes the most quoted moment of the entire interview. But talking about people and understanding them are two very different things. The audience erupts. Applause spreads across the studio. A few people even stand. Joy looks out toward the crowd, surprised by the intensity of the reaction. For a moment, the tension that filled the room earlier begins to dissolve. Sunny leans forward again. I think that's actually a fair point, she says. Whoopi nods. Yeah, it is. Joy exhales and leans back slightly in her chair. Well, she says with a half smile, I didn't expect our morning chat to turn into philosophy. The audience laughs. Brad laughs too, the first genuine laugh he's had in several minutes. Neither did I. The mood finally begins to ease. But the moment has already happened. Everyone in the room knows it. Because the exchange between Brad Pitt and Joy Behar wasn't the usual celebrity interview. It was something far more raw. And the moment the cameras cut to commercial, the energy inside the studio explodes. Audience members begin whispering to each other. Some clap again. A few even shout supportive comments toward Brad as the hosts adjust their microphones. One producer rushes across the floor speaking urgently into a headset. Because everyone behind the scenes knows exactly what just happened. This clip is going to be everywhere. Within minutes of the show ending, the segment begins spreading across the internet. Clips from The View flood social media platforms. Some viewers praise Brad Pitt for calmly defending his personal life. Others debate whether Joy Behar pushed too far. Comment sections explode with arguments. Supporters write things like, Brad handled that with class. He finally said what celebrities have wanted to say for years. Others defend Joy. She asked the questions people wanted answers to. That's literally her job. Entertainment outlets begin publishing headlines within hours. Brad Pitt clashes with Joy Behar on The View. Tense moment leaves studio silent. Brad Pitt's emotional response goes viral. The clip racks up millions of views overnight. And suddenly the interview that was supposed to be just another celebrity appearance becomes one of the most talked about television moments of the year. But beyond the headlines and debates, something else lingers. A simple question. Where exactly is the line between curiosity and intrusion? Between conversation and spectacle? And that question is what people continue arguing about long after the cameras stop rolling. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Brad Pitt was right to push back? Or do you think Joy Behar was simply doing her job by asking the difficult questions? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective is part of the conversation. And if you enjoy dramatic celebrity stories and unforgettable moments like this one, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, like this video, and share it with your friends. because on Stage View, we bring you the moments that Hollywood can't stop talking about. And trust us, the next story might be even more explosive.